We're now going to look at anthropocentrism and cleverness of non-human animals as a possible basis for this phenomenon. So we need to start by defining anthropocentrism, which, by the way, you should not confuse with anthropomorphism. That'll be coming up in a different segment. Anthropocentrism is when we tend to view the behavior of non-human organisms from a human perspective. In other words, we relate to certain organisms based on the kinds of things that we typically are able to do. So basically, we kind of put ourselves at the center of the universe and view everything from a human type perspective. So, for example, can an incarcerated human do what these two pandas are doing? Well, yes, they can. I don't know about the size of that opening, but after all, that panda can fit through it, so why can't a human? But, helping one another out like that. Of course, the guy that's left behind, he or she is stuck. But that's the kind of thing that you can envision a human doing. We begin with what we can do, and then when we see a non-human organism doing it, we think, oh, that's pretty clever. And so you can see where I'm going with this, and here's just another example. That dog is not the dog in this video. Every time I play this video and the doorbell rings, my dog goes ballistic. Thinks there's somebody at the door. But look at what this dog is doing. So now it has an empty can of soda. And who's going to get blamed for all that? The cat. So, that's pretty clever. We could see ourselves doing something like that, perhaps, putting the blame on someone else for something that we do. So with that in mind, let's look at how clever some non-human organisms actually are, starting with killer whales. So there's different hunting strategies that whales have, and it seems to be based on different areas where they happen to be located. So off the coast of Patagonia, and to the best of my knowledge, is the only place where we see this strategy. This is what happens.
But this nursery isn't a safe place. The ocean's apex predators, and one of the most intelligent animals in the water. This Patagonian shore is the only place in the world where killer whales have learned to beach themselves as a hunting technique. It's a very risky maneuver. If they get stranded on land, their bodies would quickly collapse under their own weight. The killer whales patrolling Patagonia's beaches have learned how to wriggle back to deeper water. The hunter's window of opportunity is short-lived.
So that's pretty dangerous for a whale to beach itself, as the narrator said. Kind of difficult hearing that narrator. But they do risk beaching themselves and not being able to get into the water. But again, this is something that apparently occurs only off the coast of Patagonia among this group of killer whales. Dolphins have some clever strategies as well in terms of catching prey. Here's one example.
These are bottlenose dolphins, one of the most intelligent animals on Earth. Their prey is very elusive, fast-swimming fish. But the dolphins have invented a completely new way of hunting. By beating its tail down hard, this dolphin stirs up the shallow silt. And by swimming in a tight circle, it creates a ring of mushrooming mud around a shoal of fish. contracting ring traps the fish just like a net. Panicked, the fish jump to escape, right into the open mouths of the waiting dolphins. Again and again, the lead dolphin creates a circle before they all line up with perfect timing. These dolphins are the only ones known to have developed this hunting behavior, and it gives them an edge.
So that's very clever and obviously quite effective. Now, off the coast of South Carolina, there's another hunting strategy by a group of dolphins. And again, I think this strategy is unique to this particular population. And it's something like this. In fact, it's very similar to the beaching that we saw in the killer whales. So what they do is a couple of them will get together and swim very rapidly near the shore, back and forth, creating these waves, trapping schools of fish. I think they're particularly fond of mullet, for example, which are plentiful in this particular area. And the waves tend to actually wash the mullet on shore. And then what the dolphins do is they semi-beach themselves, grab the mullet, and then slide back into the water. So here's a film that shows this happening. And by the way, birds are pretty quick to pick up on this. When they see the dolphins, they start to gather because they can get some of the fish as well. Now in that case, it wasn't so much the swimming back and forth and generating waves, but rather just swimming toward the school of mullet and chasing them on shore. So variations of that strategy, but basically this is where the only place that I'm aware of where this kind of happens. And again, it's dangerous for the dolphins as it is for the killer whales, because if they get trapped, if they beach themselves, they could have a very difficult time getting back into the water, though not as difficult a time as a killer whale. I have a feeling that the dolphins would manage to somehow get back into the water. Now, it's not surprising to see this among cetaceans, or whales and dolphins. And the reason for that is that they evolved from land creatures. And here you see a rough sketch of who the ancestor was, and then how things started to change throughout evolution. Now that, of course, is not a modern cetacean, but it's still one of the ancestors, but it's fully aquatic at this point relative to where it evolved from, or what it evolved from. Here's some animations that that also depict what's happening, or what happened rather. So going from one of the earliest forms, and now we have a probably semi-aquatic form at that point. But then this form is probably fully aquatic, I would imagine. These all come from the fossil record, pretty well documented. And then the next form, which obviously is very cetacean-like. This is just another animation that I happen to like a lot that pretty much shows the same thing. So again, we start with our earliest terrestrial form. And then go to the next evolved form. And then the next, which is now a water creature. And a pre-cetacean aquatic animal. Do we have one more? Oh, we have one more. And just to show you how dolphins sometimes come on land, even though they are now dolphins, this is a woman at an aquarium. I think it's according to the t-shirt, it's the National Aquarium. So that would be, where's the National Aquarium? It's either in Baltimore or in Washington, D.C. I think it's Baltimore, actually. Whatever. Anyway, she's talking about a dolphin, and watch what the dolphin does. Now, this is a silent clip. You can see the dolphin's nose. There it comes. And she was not expecting that. So yeah, sometimes they will come on land, so you got to watch out. So let's look at cetaceans a little bit more carefully. So here's a whale right here. And if you look at the bone structure in the flippers, it really is the same bone structure that mammals have in their paws or that we have in our hands. There's a close-up X-ray. So again, pretty good evidence that whales evolved from some kind of terrestrial mammalian type creature. And then if we look at how the flippers actually develop prenatally, so here we have some dolphin embryos at different stages of development. And you can see starts out as a limb bud, just like any mammalian limb, including us. And then it starts to become more differentiated, so you see more webbing here than you would see in an embryonic human. And then it becomes very flipper-like. And then further on, prenatally, this is all prenatal, very flipper-like, as they become even more fully enlarged and differentiated from this undifferentiated limb bud rather. And what about the hind limbs? So again, we have some hind limbs, dolphin hind limbs here. And what happens, this is very interesting, because again, we're going from younger to older, and you can see what's happening. There's virtually nothing that's happening there developmentally. But then we look a little bit further on in prenatal development, and we see the beginnings of a hind limb actually forming. Now, dolphins and whales don't have hind limbs. They have flippers and they have tails, but no hind limbs. Well, this is what's happening. We start to see later on a regression of what formed over here. And then finally, before birth, even though this is still well before birth, this last one, it's basically gone altogether. So it starts to develop, but then it regresses. And more than likely, I don't know if this part's been documented yet in this particular species, that's probably due to the timing of certain types of genes. That's at least my guess. So, what is the likely terrestrial ancestor of cetaceans? People used to think that it was dogs, actually, but now we have better evidence from DNA as well as other studies that show that no, it was not a dog-like creature, it was more of a hippopotamus-like creature. This is not to say that cetaceans evolved from hippopotamuses, they did not, but there was a common ancestor at some point. So there we have the final statement from this journal article, and it's one of many. This one comes from 2007. One of many articles that actually point in the same direction of a hippopotamus-like ancestor for cetaceans. Okay, moving on. This is another very clever form of hunting on the part of green herons. So notice that it has a piece of food in its bill. Okay? It drops the food into the water and it waits. Fish come along to eat the food, and in goes the heron very, very quickly to grab the fish. That's pretty clever. That's fishing. That's like we fish, only we don't do it quite that way. Here we have a video. So it's going to reposition that food and then watch what happens quickly. There, got it. Actually, that's a pretty sizable fish. But that fish was going after the bait, and the heron got the fish. Tool use, a form of insight learning, is another good example of how clever animals can be. This is a fairly recent study from 2013 showing how crocodiles and alligators actually adorn their heads with twigs and then wait by the shore for wading birds in search of nesting material to come and grab these twigs, unsuspecting the fact that they're on top of an alligator or crocodile head. So there comes a shorebird, and there goes the shorebird. That's what's left of the shorebird. So it works. It works for alligators and crocodiles that utilize this particular strategy. This is another example of really clever behavior in probably the most highly evolved form of bird in terms of intelligence. This would be the group of birds known as crows and ravens, in other words, corvids. Look at what's going on here.
Crows have become highly skilled at making a living in these new urban environments. In this Japanese city, they have devised a way of eating a food that normally they can't manage. Dropping a nut from a great height onto a hard road does sometimes crack it, but some nuts are particularly tough. So the crows have devised a better way. Drop it among the traffic. The problem now is collecting the bits without getting run over. So some birds have refined their technique. They station themselves beside pedestrian crossings. Wait for the lights to stop the traffic. Then collect your cracked nut in safety.
like the way it kind of stayed in the crosswalk on its way out. Birds are incredibly clever. Crows in particular. We know so much more in recent years about the intelligence and the various cognitive capabilities of birds, and again, especially crows, than we were ever aware of. And hopefully we'll get to some of that later in the course. Okay, scrub jays, also very, very clever animals. They actually can plan for the future. You know, sometimes you have a lot of food available and sometimes you don't. And that's where animals will cache food. They'll capture food and then cache it, meaning bury it, store it away, and eat it at a later date. Foxes are really good at this, for example. But so are scrub jays, as well as other species of birds. In fact, we'll encounter some of them in later segments. But for now, let's look at this very clever experiment that was done with scrub jays and how they're capable of planning for the future.
If they can travel back in their mind's eye to think about the past, can they also travel forward in the mind's eye to think about the future? Can they plan ahead?
To find out, Nikki creates an experiment based on a very human annoyance: waking up to find breakfast is off the menu. For 6 days, the birds are housed in this aviary, split into 3 zones. In the middle is the dining room, where the birds are fed during the day. And at either end are the bedrooms, where they are kept at night. But there's a twist. Kept overnight in this bedroom on the right, the birds are served an early breakfast. But kept overnight in this room on the left, they get no breakfast, and they go hungry till mid-morning. The birds experience this daily routine for almost a week.
So we give them 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the hungry room and 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the room that serves breakfast. But the important point is that the birds themselves didn't know which room they'd end up in on any given day.
But then, Nikki starts allowing the birds to cache food. She places trays full of sand in both the hungry and breakfast rooms. The birds can use these to bury dead grubs in. The question is, where will they choose to store the food? Nikki wants to know if the birds can use their experience of the hungry and breakfast rooms and plan for the future. For Nikki, the results are clear.
The birds cache about 5 times as much in the hungry room as they cache in the breakfast room.
The scrub jays store 5 times more grubs in the room where no breakfast is served than in the room where they are well fed.
They can imagine what they're going to need the following morning when they wake up hungry, so they can solve a problem before it's even happened. So what this experiment shows is that the birds can plan for the future.
And again, in terms of anthropocentrism, we do exactly the same thing. We go out, we buy food, we don't bring it home and eat it immediately, unless you're going to a fast food restaurant or something. But no, you go to the grocery store, you store it, you cache it in the cupboard or the refrigerator for when you're going to actually need it. So, again, anthropocentrism at work. So, let's go back to anthropocentrism now that we've looked at some clever examples. One possibility here, in terms of when you look at the kinds of animals that we get a little bit anthropocentric about, they tend to be animals that are not quote-unquote ugly, for lack of a better term. They don't look unusual. They don't necessarily look like us, but we tend to only get anthropocentric toward animals that we can somehow relate to in some particular way, that are somewhat human-like, even though they're far afield from humans. Let me give you some examples here of ones that we probably would never get anthropocentric about, like a warthog or a proboscis monkey, because of that nose, or certainly a star-nosed mole, and definitely not the blobfish. So, you know, there could be some relationship there, or not, it's really hard to tell. But a study was published in 2010 that looked at when humans start to show signs of anthropocentrism. The prevailing view up until the point of this study was that, well, we're born that way. It just happens from birth, even though there's really no way of looking at that in a baby. But people have always just assumed that. Again, it's the usual genetic deterministic argument that doesn't really hold water until you start looking more carefully at the situation. Well, what this study found is that, and I'm not going to go into details about the study, was that it really starts to kick in between the ages of 3 and 5 years of age when kids look like that. So it's not something that happens from birth. It's something that develops, like everything else, develops over time. And finally, we as mammals, because we are mammals, really don't have anything to be anthropocentric about in terms of viewing ourselves as the center of the universe. There's hardly any of us around relative to other species. So if you look at this figure, the different life forms that you see here are drawn to a scale that represents the number of species that inhabit the Earth. And so if you look at the primary species here are insects. There are more species of insects than any other life form on Earth. They're the ones that should be anthropocentric. I guess it would be called insectocentric or something like that. But then, we just go down the line. We look at these other forms. And so there's a lot of different species of these other types. But then as we move further and further up in the drawing, there are fewer representative species of each form. And then finally, we get to the bottom of the scale, and that's us, mammals. Fewer species of mammals than any of these other forms. So, in reality, we don't have a lot to be anthropocentric about. On the other hand, we're the ones who make the rules. So take that for what it's worth. Anyway, that's anthropocentrism and some very, very clever non-human organisms.